Welcome to the dinner table, a discussion with food as a lens into cultures and societies. I'm your host, Fred Opie. But I started blogging on this whole theme of feeding the revolution, role of food and social movements. And it started out from listening to the Kitchen Sisters. And they have a series that is played on an NPR broadcast called Hidden Kitchens. And they did one on the Montgomery bus boycott, focusing on a woman named Georgia Gilmore. And it was just so interesting, the role that this woman played in supporting that movement with the money that she and other women in the community helped raise via a bake sale. So that was like the first time I had heard of a way of looking at this idea of feeding revolution. And the term itself, I'm not really sure. And I don't remember exactly where it came, but I just thought about this and started looking at other examples of feeding the revolution. This is how a lot of my projects start. I do it off of book reviews. From there, I just started looking up these themes. And when I wrote my first book, Hog and Hominy, there's a section there on the civil rights movement. And, in the course of teaching courses like Food and African American Canon, which is a course I teach, Food and African American History, and all those different courses, when I'm prepping for the courses, I would come across information and it would fit, and then I would do a blog. So ultimately, that's what happened. So a couple things to tell you about eating out during Jim Crow in Washington, D.C. My students find it amazing, particularly those from other countries, and we have quite a few international students here, that when they think of the United States, they think of the land of democracy and the beacon of democracy when it comes to free and democratic countries. So when they hear that in our nation's capital, there were Jim Crow seating, they are often amazed. In Washington, D.C., without a doubt, there were Jim Crow policies. But that was the case throughout many parts of the United States, that there were these Jim Crow policies. The thing about Jim Crow is it comes into fruition by white supremacists in the South right after the period of Reconstruction. Reconstruction is from 1865 to roughly 1877 is the beginning of Reconstruction. So 1965, the Reconstruction period, the end of it is 1877, and then the period of Jim Crow, most of us as scholars will say is the 1880s and after the election of 1877. So from 1877 all the way up until, I'd say the late 1960s, the Jim Crow policies determined life for most people in the South, including our nation's capital. So there were places in the nation's capital where you could be a foreign diplomat from another country and you had the wrong complexion, and they wouldn't let you in a restaurant to eat despite your diplomatic credentials. And certainly that was the case for many African Americans throughout Washington, D.C. There were about 3 restaurants in Washington, D.C. One of them was at an art museum, and the person who donated the money, a lot of money, they made sure that was part of the bylaws of that art museum, that they had a cafeteria there and it was completely integrated. So that's just one of those things. The other place I believe was a YMCA up near Capitol Hill. And then the other place, I cannot remember right now offhand, but there are really 3 places like that. So where did most African Americans go if they were eating outside their home? Excuse me. A lot of them would go to the U Street corridor. And the U Street corridor would be the place where not only could you get good food, but you could listen to great jazz music. So there were these restaurants. I have names of some of them I'll pull up here that you can see: the Crystal Cavern, Lincoln Colonnade, Club Benghazi, Gypsy, West Hotel Cairo, the Ballroom Northeast Casino, Club Puram, among others. So there were a bunch of these in the U Street corridor. And by the way, the U Street corridor today in Washington, D.C. has undergone a tremendous gentrification, and it's kind of the hot spot in Washington, D.C. now. A lot of new restaurants, a lot of new kind of retail spaces as well as restaurants there. By the way, there's a Trader Joe's right there on that street, and right around the corner there's a Whole Foods. So all those are indicators of the economic revival that's happened there. But if you went back to the 1920s through the 1970s, 1920, 1940, 1950, it was a hotspot. And it was one of those hotspots that African Americans, and you would see some white customers in these restaurants and jazz clubs. Now, what's interesting is in Jim Crow is that whites had the options of going into black owned and operated restaurants and jazz clubs. And but African Americans didn't have the option. At the same time, if you went to a segregated restaurant or jazz club or venue in Washington, D.C., it was African Americans who would be the entertainers and it would be African Americans who worked in the kitchen. So it's just this ironic scenario where you are in a segregated restaurant. You can't go in there, but you can work there. You can't go in there, but you can deliver food there. You can't go in there as a customer, but you can play as a artist in those venues. And then in the African American owned and operated, and then there were quite a few of them in the U Street corridor in Northwest Washington, D.C., where you would see a lot of all different types of clientele, including whites, in those venues. So it was a very just kind of a interesting thing to think about. Um, the protest, the protest to integrate restaurants in Washington D.C. begins in the 1940s and 1950s. I think close to the 1950s, and the key people in that. I just want to take a look at my on my watch to make sure we stay on time here. But the key people in those are Mary Church Terrell. She's a key element in this, leading these movements there. And the other one is the election of the first African American to serve in the House of Representatives since Reconstruction. Now, something important to say, during Reconstruction, there were more African Americans that served in the House of Representatives and Congress as well as the U.S. Senate than any other period in American history, including today. That's an amazing thing to think about, but that is the case. What we do know that when Adam Clayton Powell was elected to Congress from New York, he was the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, which is in the Harlem section, Washington Heights, Harlem section of New York. He was elected, and he was elected coming off of being an activist in New York. So I actually talk about the civil rights movement in New York around food and food spaces and jobs in the food industry. He very much came to popular influence as an activist around those movements, and it propelled him to election in Washington, D.C. Now, what's really funny and interesting about Adam Clayton Powell, I'll just say interesting, is first of all, he's an extremely light-skinned African American. He is light enough to actually pass, very straight hair and very light-skinned. However, he is a person who is unapologetically African American. And so one of the first things he does when he gets to Washington, D.C. and realizes that he's in this Jim Crow enclave in this city, the nation's capital, is he makes it his business to integrate the eating places, particularly the cafeteria on Capitol Hill, where congressmen ate. It was a segregated venue. So what he would do is, by his own words, again, you can read this in his autobiography, is he would go out onto the street in and around Washington, D.C., around Capitol Hill, and he would find the darkest complexioned African American, and he would invite that person to actually show up and eat with him. And so it was pretty funny that he was doing this as a congressman and to push the boundaries and test the laws and the customs on Capitol Hill. So it was he who first went to Eisenhower when he's elected to office in the 1950s. He goes to Eisenhower and he begins a relationship with Eisenhower to end segregation. So you have Mary Church Terrell, another activist in Washington, D.C., going and trying to integrate some of the venues there. And then you have on Capitol Hill, you have Adam Clayton Powell working behind the scenes with Eisenhower. So Powell's a Democrat, Eisenhower's a Republican. But remember, Eisenhower is a former military person, and the military certainly was integrated much more faster and earlier than many other parts of American culture and society. So Eisenhower came from this perspective that segregation is wrong, we need to end it, and it's not good for the nation. At the same time, he is leading a party who has many members in it who think that Jim Crow is fine. And so Eisenhower is, behind the scenes working and trying to get members of his administration and his staff to end segregation in Washington, D.C. And I would argue that between the push of the activists on the street, Mary Church Terrell and her members, and then Adam Clayton Powell and the political maneuvers that he's doing behind the scenes, slowly but surely, segregation ends in Washington, D.C. But it was a very difficult place that, as an African American, if you worked in and around Capitol Hill, it was hard to find a place where you could actually eat, a place that was decent. So, you could have been a lawyer, you could have been a professional, you could have been a tradesman, and it would be difficult to find something to eat other than street food. So that's the scenario and situation of Washington, D.C., and it remains that way up into the 1950s. Now, an interesting thing I found in doing research, for the book was it is roughly a year to 2 years later that Eisenhower sends troops into Little Rock, Arkansas to integrate the high school there. Okay, now I want you to think about this. All right, here's Eisenhower. The governor of Arkansas refuses to abide by a Supreme Court edict that we need to integrate schools by all deliberate speed. And the Arkansas governor basically says, "Over my dead body." And here's Eisenhower, a military guy, who he's not used to and doesn't tolerate somebody being belligerent to the commander in chief, whether it's in the military or him as the president. So he sends in troops, and it's roughly 2 years after he begins to integrate restaurants and all kinds of venues in Washington, D.C. So I see that as a really important precursor to what happens in Little Rock. Now, I remember I mentioned early on in the talk between 1865 to 1877 is the period of Reconstruction. It's just after the Civil War. The United States is trying to get the country back together and trying to make sure that the southern states that rebelled during the war come back in, but come back in with the right people in local state government. And in order for that to happen, you had to assure that African Americans, poor whites, and other folks who were disenfranchised before the Civil War had the right to actually vote and had the right to hold a public office. And there were more African Americans, poor whites, in public office during the period of Reconstruction than any other period in American history. But in order for that to happen, there had to be federal troops that were sent south. So the period where you have Reconstruction and all these political gains that happen, they happen because the U.S. government is using its troops to enforce the actual laws. It's the old saying I say to my students, what's the speed limit in most highways around the country? It's 55. If you're on the thruway, 65. But you could get run over going 55 or 65 in most of those areas where that actually is a speed limit. Why? Because there's no popo around to enforce the speed limit. Well, that was the case with voting rights and the right to run for public office. Unless there were federal troops there, they didn't. Now, I say all that to you to say that the integration of schools that happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, and then the rest of the South, they happen because Eisenhower sends troops down to Arkansas, and that allows for the integration of schools. So I would argue that Eisenhower's first foray into the civil rights movement happens with restaurants in Washington, D.C., and then from there, you see him increasingly intervening in the affairs of the South with the help of U.S. troops in Arkansas. So it's just one of those things to keep in mind when you look at this whole idea of the role that food plays in the civil rights movement. Again, beginning in Washington, D.C. A couple other images I want to show before we turn to Q&A. This is the Whitehall Hotel, African-American owned and operated hotel in Washington, D.C. And it's one of those venues, again, where, we often just forget the experience of being, whether it be Hispanic, Jewish, or African-American. If you were traveling or eating out, tomorrow I'm heading to New York for an event. And if I want to stay overnight and it was Washington, D.C., unless I could find an African-American owned and operated hotel, there's no way that I'm going to be able to stay overnight. And there's no place I'm going to be able to actually to eat. So it was places like this. Here's the back of the house of the same place, the Whitehall Hotel. Again, it used to be in the U Street corridor. These were venues owned and operated by African Americans, and one of the few venues where African Americans could sit down and have a white tablecloth experience. most of the other places were kind of greasy spoons, if you were to think about it that way. Here is a picture of Satchmo, Louis Armstrong, performing in Washington, D.C. And you could go to the U Street corridor clubs and restaurants and listen to Satchmo. You could listen to Charlie Parker. You could listen to Duke Ellington. I mean, some of the most renowned figures in jazz history would be in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. and some of those venues were a part of the larger Chitlin circuit. Those were the places, some of them more elegant than others, some hole in the walls, but they were the places that were owned and operated by African Americans where you could go as a performer and do your thing, as it were. So Washington, D.C. is a really important place when it comes to the food scene and particularly the jazz scene in U.S. history. We often think about New Orleans, and certainly Louis Armstrong is a citizen of or native of New Orleans, but it's just one of those venues that often people don't think about. So I think Chicago is the same way. It's an important spot. We all know about New Orleans. We all know about some of the places in like the Palladium and some of the other places, the Cotton Club in New York City. But I mean, DC was hopping, and you could get some really good food back in the day. Here's one of the early restaurant chains that people integrated, and it was a place called the Thompsons. It was kind of a luncheonette place, and it was called Thompson's. They had restaurants, in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and in Pittsburgh. And when Mary Church Terrell and her group began to boycott these places, this is one of the first restaurant chains that they integrated. There's the Hot Shots, if you're from the DC area, it's a place. And I tried to find out where they stood during this time because the Hot Shots have been around for a long time. But I do know Thompson's ended up actually, there were all kinds of court cases over whether it was legal or not to actually boycott. If you can see on the PowerPoint some of what's available here on the menu at the Hot Shops, it's kind of cool too. And it says chicken pot pie. There's watermelon 10 cents, cantaloupe 15 cents, buttermilk. Let's see, churned buttermilk 5 cents. There's a whole platter of food that you can get for lunchtime for 25 cents. Good gracious alive! Imagine if we could eat like that today.
We'll be right back. For more interviews and related content, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and other podcast distributors. Also, check out our website at www.fredopie.com. Ask questions on Facebook at Frederick Douglass Opie and on Twitter at Dr. Fred D. Opie. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com.
Hey folks, if you're enjoying this episode of the Fred Opie Show Food Podcast, check out other episodes on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher, or wherever you listen to the show. One recent episode you might enjoy is called Changing Hiring Practices in the Food Industry, which is an excerpt from a book talk that Fred did about his most recent book and touches on some of the social and political movements that changed the way that African Americans and other minorities were hired in the food industry, specifically in grocery store chains. Here's a short excerpt from that show, which once again is available on SoundCloud.
If you look at these movements, they're very much like selling a product for the first time. You have to have proof of concept. Direct Action gained proof of concept in Chicago. And once they had that proof of concept, it took off. So that's the other thing. It as a strategy, once it gained its success in Chicago, it quickly spread throughout the rest of the United States and African American communities. And it's the same thing with any product. If you don't have success or credibility, that's going to be the end of it.
Now let's get back to Fred's webinar about the social protests in Jim Crow era Washington, D.C. Enjoy the show.
Look, so I want to turn to the Q&A. It is the first time for me doing this, so please, folks, bear with me as I try to use this aspect of this online presentation. We're gonna work on doing this on a weekly or biweekly basis and just unpacking different sections of the book. So if you want to write in your questions, by all means, you could do that. And I'd love to hear what your questions are. Let's go to Anthony.
How would you compare sort of the cultural and racial segregation in restaurants then as opposed to now?
So, we're looking at segregation. It happens, it's what I would call de facto segregation today in restaurants and de facto economic segregation that happens. So it definitely exists. And a lot of it is price tag. It's what you can afford to eat and certainly what neighborhood can you afford to live in. And I think related to that, I was just in D.C. last summer doing research at the Library of Congress. And I always get a little irritated when I come to the nation's capital because it is, for African Americans, first of all, we call D.C. Chocolate City because there are so many African Americans that live and reside in the nation's capital. Yet when you go to Capitol Hill, it is like remember the old rap artist Vanilla Ice? It's like white. And when it comes to restaurants, you will see that in these sections, you see very few African Americans because they don't live and work there, and often the price tag. So I think we do experience segregation today, but it is largely an economic segregation rather than a politically legislated legislation. Let's go on to Jennifer.
Well, I was curious. You had mentioned that there was a lack of eateries available for African Americans in D.C. during that time, and it seems like there would be a business there. It seems like there would be opportunities that would allow African American owned businesses to pop up to serve that market. And I was just wondering if you saw that at all.
Great question. So what you see during this time period is the influence of redlining. So when it came time to get money from banks to open a business, there were certain places because the banks were owned and operated, many of the banks, not all of them. There's the Carter Bank that was an African American owned bank in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure when it opened, but it comes down to what happens when you're trying to get the capital necessary to open a restaurant in and around Capitol Hill. African Americans couldn't make that happen. So they do own and operate restaurants, but they're in Northwest Washington, D.C., around the U Street corridor that we talked about, but not on Capitol Hill. Now, you will see more street vendors selling food, kind of mom and pop street vendors in and around Washington, D.C., selling things like sandwiches and stuff like that, but no brick and mortar places. You couldn't get the money to open them or operate them in and around Capitol Hill. Great question. Catherine, you have a question.
I was just wondering, it was going back to your kind of one of your very early statements was you were talking about how whites have the option to, during Jim Crow policies, they had the option, but African Americans didn't. And I was wondering in these establishments if there was any kind of, if a white customer decided to randomly come to an African American establishment, what kind of crazy accommodations had to be made, or did they have to scramble to create a segregated space?
Great question. When a white customer came into one of these establishments, you didn't have to make a lot of changes. It was, they just treated you like another customer. Now, I'm sure when you walked in, you might have got some looks, like, do you know where you are? One of those kind of things. But I think a lot of these places, they knew when a particular artist came to town, it was going to attract a very diverse culture, group of clientele, including whites. And it didn't seem from any of the descriptions I had that people had a problem with it. They just kind of got used to it, and that was it. So there wasn't a lot of adjustment that had to be made. Yet, if you're an African American and you went to one of the segregated places, there's a great account, and I'm working on another book that looks at the role the food plays in great literature. And this is, the most recent we had a book that come out. A documentary film came out on James Baldwin, and he gives this great account that when he was going to do correspondence work in the Deep South of walking into a segregated restaurant. Again, being a guy from Harlem, never been South in his life, and he just walks in the front door of one of these segregated places. And the experience is just like, whoa, he just gets these looks, he gets these messages, he gets his finger in his face. As a white coming into a place, that would be the case. Now, one thing to keep in mind is how police who would be enforcing these lines of segregation might respond to a white person in one of these environments. We have a lot of these stories of juke joints down south where whites would also come to some of those places. It really depended because some of these places, part of the white power structure, who were married men, that's where they would go to get their fling on. And it was kind of an accepted, see no evil, hear no evil by the forces that be. There were other instances that if you were a white person, now, if you're a white male, it was like, okay, but a white female to be in there by herself, well, that's trouble in River City. That's one of the things that I have seen in history in terms of that go. And let me talk a little bit about the food too in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is one of these places that, though it's a southern city, there are migrants coming from particularly the states of Alabama and Virginia and the Carolinas coming up there. And so a lot of the food culture that you would see in Washington, D.C. is very much similar to the food culture you would see with migrants who went to places like New York. So some of the menus were pretty interesting, where you would see, of course, your typical fried chicken on the menu, but you'd also see things like spaghetti on the menu. You see a lot of seafood on the menu. One of the things that I think of when I go to Washington, D.C. is crabs, crab cakes, because of the water all around there. So some of the best crab cakes that I've had have been in Washington, D.C. Also, Baltimore is another thing. So, that's a lot of the menu. You see your typical greens, whether it be kale, collard greens, made with, fat back or salted pork. Those are all typical things that you would see on the menu at any of these restaurants that I'm talking about. You would also see, as I said, a lot of kind of ethnic food where you did see a lot of pasta on the menu. You saw a lot of stews, lima beans and gravy, a lot of those type of dishes. And also, for those who haven't gotten the book yet, this book is very similar to the book I did on Zero Hurston and Florida food, also with the History Press. It's a book that has period recipes in it. So when you get the book and you're reading the chapter that we're talking about Washington, D.C., I actually have descriptions of what was served in those restaurants that I mentioned during the presentation in those jazz clubs. And then there are related recipes in that chapter, so you can cook foods from those time periods. And they're, 1940s, 1950s restaurant, menus from these different things. And I've cooked with them. Now, if you're one of those cooks that needs to have everything exactly measured, it's going to be problematic because many of the African-American newspapers that I used to find out more about these places, they have recipes, but they're recipes for the home cook, and they don't always have those kind of very exact measurements in them. But I've been cooking with them, and I've actually been running them on my blog right now. If you go to fredopie.com and go to the blog, you'll see we've been in the Lenten season, so a lot of recipes around Lent. But every chapter, the chapter in Alabama has recipes from that time period. That has a recipe as close as I could find to Georgia Gilmore's famous pound cake recipe. The woman was known for making great fried chicken, but in every city they say that their chicken is better than some other parts of the South. But in those things you can see a number of the kind of fried chicken recipes that you'll be talking about. There are a lot of baked good recipes in that chapter on Montgomery. There's the chapter on New Orleans where, of course, you're going to find gumbo and gumbo recipes from Dookie Chase's actual recipes from Dookie Chase, her restaurant right there in New Orleans, which played an important part in the whole civil rights movement. So I want you to keep in mind that's something that's just as much a part of the book as the images itself. I also would say to you, if you buy the book and you're interested in me signing it, by all means, send it to me here at my address at Babson College. I will sign it and I'll send it back. I'll probably put some extra things in there as an incentive for you to do that. Sign it for you if you want to sign, put more than one book in there. I'd be glad to sign it and get it. If you also are interested in hosting a book event, sometimes authors will go to book clubs. If you have a book club, you're interested. If you're at an institution and you're interested in having me come and talking about the book, we welcome all those opportunities. It's just, I know that the online book event gives me the option of traveling to more places without having to leave my family or be in the midst of grading, which often is going on. We don't even want to talk about grading. That can get real depressing talking about that. But that's just the reality of doing it. So my goal is to try to do one of these each Thursday from 12 to 1 as a lunchtime event and have those that listen and enjoy it invite people to come out, because ultimately it's going to be word of mouth that finds out about it. Also would entertain the opportunity to actually do a workshop on how I actually write and do the work of food history. Where I get my sources, where do I get my images? One of the things that I try to do in my own work as a blogger is to come up with some fantastic historical images, and I'll share those kind of things. Where you get the images, and the images, most of the ones I get are rights free. So if you're interested in having a blog and using these images, I can share all those things. Some of the sources I have. If you look at some of the quotes, you might be wondering, where did you get that stuff? Well, a lot of the sources that I use came from historically black newspapers, Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, the Amsterdam News. I mean, the content in that is tremendous. If you're somebody's in graduate school or thinking about a book project, there is a book to be written about African American food writers between the 1920s or even earlier, but most of the time I see them 1920s through the 1950s. There's just some absolutely fascinating writing goes on that a lot of people don't necessarily know about these people, and I've been using their writings as part of my blogging. And then the other part that I would say is the Library of Congress has some of the richest documentation on foodways of all ethnicities, during the Great Depression as part of its America Eats project. So those are areas that I have delved into, and I just find that period of the Great Depression, roughly, the late 1920s through the early 1940s, it's just chock full of a lot of stuff that that I find that is pretty cool and interesting.
To check out our podcast archive, suggest show topics, and advertise on the show, and to book me as a guest and or speaker, visit our website, www.fredopie.com. That's www.fredopie.com. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and be good.